Okay, so this is chapter 1, Introduction for Research Methods. Why care about research methods? All right, so people are exposed to a lot of information in their daily lives, especially now that we live in this kind of internet-based information age. We hear a lot of pseudoscience, right? Often through clickbait articles and, of course, through the mainstream media, where sound bites tend to reduce complicated arguments down to talking points that may oversimplify or obscure the actual research findings. So much of this information can be inaccurate, misleading, or conflicting. So it depends on who's saying it, who benefits from saying it, if the methods involved are appropriate or not. So I hear this with food the most, right? So first something's good for you, then it's bad for you, right? Like coffee or eggs or fat or whatever, right? There's a conflicting body of research that if you handpick an article here or there outside of the context of the overall body of research, what you find might be an outlier, or at least not representative of paradigms of knowledge that already, claim to represent that knowledge. So you'll hear something like, don't eat chocolate, or it's terrible, or, eating chocolate can prevent Alzheimer's, things like that. It can be very conflicting, and you're like, well, what am I supposed to believe? Right? So how do you know what to believe? This is where rigorous research methods can help us sort out the fact from the fiction. So some of the benefits of studying research methods, it can help you become a more critical consumer of research evidence so that you can first, obviously, read and understand research reports and articles. So you can understand relevant arguments, understand what research methods were employed with that, understanding specifically the population, the sample. These things can really help you evaluate the validity of research that you come across. You will know what questions to ask to evaluate the quality of information. So when you know the process, you can deconstruct how other research is done and understand the potential flaws and pitfalls of their overall design, or any potential different theories or concepts that could be applied to what findings they did find. So this could even be other potential spurious variables that may be at play, that are maybe influencing what is being observed. So in the mainstream media, there's a strong emphasis on polling, which is not necessarily bad. But if the polls themselves are not representative or valid, then what information they present may tell you something, but it cannot be extrapolated to others or larger groups. So for example, cable news networks love to hold polls on their websites or their apps, asking subscribing members what they feel. So this is going to net very different results than a larger, more rigorous survey that is done by some sort of research firm that's a third-party interest that has no, bias in the research. They're going to find different things. And mostly that's just because what population you're looking at, right? So if your population you're trying to study with a poll is Americans, but your sample is only the people who go to your website, like those, mainstream media polls, then the results are going to be affected by the difference in that grouping. So meaning maybe Fox News watchers are going to feel differently about something than viewers of MSNBC. So using that one poll to say 73% of Americans think that blah, 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 it's like, well, what Americans, right? Who is the population? And who is the sample that they use? Does that actually represent the overall population? Those things are important. So again, when you understand this, you can kind of, again, sort out the fact from the fiction. So that'll help you determine whether information is credible. Once you have the tools to analyze research construction, this is going to help you become an active producer of research yourself, right? You're going to know what's credible and also know how to produce something that is. So if you want to understand the world and answer your own inquiries about the social world, learning methods is essential to being able to produce your own research on things that interest you. So, before I get into the scientific method real quick, I always like to talk about the sociological imagination, which, this is a required sociology course, so I'm assuming you're already a soc major. You've heard this a bunch of times, but this is very important, right? The looking at a person's individual experiences and the choices they make that shape their lives and ultimately shape history, but also looking at the larger social forces that shape what choices and opportunities people have in their lives that can enable or restrict them. So the time period, the culture, the specific sociocultural history, this affects individuals in the organization of their lives and ultimately of history. So how do sociologists use a scientific method, right? How are they actually studying the social world? Well, they use it like other scientists do, right? In order to evaluate a topic or query without prejudice affecting the results by using rigorous methods. So one is quantitative and qualitative. These are things we're going to be talking about quite a bit. So you're going to know a lot about the differences. If you're coming into the class not very sure, this will be, illuminated. So, it's just what kind of question you're asking is typically whether or not you're going to use quantitative or qualitative research. So if your question is small scale or large scale, it's going to be, depending whether it would be quantitative or qualitative, right? Whether your question can be answered in numbers or words, right? So I'm going to show you this quick clip that kind of explains how this works within the world of sociology.
What puts the science in social science? The things you probably think of as science, like biology or physics or chemistry, can seem a world apart from sociology and the concepts we've introduced so far. But sociology is a type of science. It's just not one that uses beakers or microscopes. Rather than investigating the physical, natural world, sociology explores the social world. Now, there are different schools of thought within sociology about the best way to understand the social world. But one of the primary means of conducting sociology uses many of the same basic principles and methods as any of your hard clinical sciences. Can sociology use the scientific method? Check. Does it rely on empirical data? Check. And graphs? Heck yeah! A science is really any practice that uses a systematic method of observation to gain knowledge. And you probably know that systematic method as the scientific method. Basically, you come up with some question about the world and then develop a testable theory about how you can answer that question. And you develop and test your theory by gathering empirical evidence, that is, verifiable information that's collected in a systematic way. Now, whether you're using it to explore the natural world or the social world, the scientific method is rooted in the philosophy known as positivism. First laid out by Auguste Comte, yes, the same Auguste Comte that we introduced as the founder of sociology a couple episodes ago, positivism argues that phenomena can be studied through direct observation, and that these observations can be pulled together into theories or facts that can help us understand how the world works. Now, you might be wondering where the positive and positivist comes into play. Was Comte just a glass half full kind of guy? Well, positive in this case doesn't refer to optimism, and it doesn't mean I'm positive that I'm right. Instead, a positive theory is one that's objective and fact-based, whereas a normative theory is subjective and value-based. Which brings us to the first of our three types of sociological inquiry: positivist sociology, or the study of society based on systematic observations of social behavior. And here, objective is the key word. As scientific researchers, sociologists must set aside their own values and beliefs to approach their work as neutral observers and use empirical evidence to answer questions about how the social world works. So, what kind of evidence are you looking for? If you're doing quantitative research, you want data. Quantitative research is the study of observable relationships in the world using mathematical or statistical methods. Basically, quantitative evidence is information that you can count or tally up. But this doesn't just mean number-based data like income or age. You can also use it to categorize people or things, like the state you live in, your gender, or your race. And quantitative evidence can be used in lots of different ways. For example, there's descriptive data, which does just what it sounds like. It describes facts relevant to the question you're researching. Like, maybe you want to know how income is distributed across households in the United States. Quantitative data are your friend here. This graph is the distribution of household incomes in 2014 produced by the US Census Bureau. The height of the bars in the graph indicate the number of households at a certain income level. And the point labeled 50th is an important one because it's the median income, the absolute middle observation in the sample. That means that 50% of households have lower incomes than that level and 50% have higher incomes. In this case, the median income is $53,700. But be careful about the conclusions you draw from this graph. The median may be the observation in the middle, but it's not the same as the average household income. That distinction goes to the mean, which is the sum of all the values divided by the number of observations. So in 2014, the mean household income was $75,700. That's a lot higher than the median. What's up with that? Why is there a gap between the mean and the median? Well, think back to the group that the Occupy Wall Street movement was concerned with, the 1%. That political label is actually a descriptive statistic. It describes the percent of the population with the highest income. And the fact that the income of that 1% is so much higher than the incomes of the other 99%, that's why we have a gap between the mean and the median. And I'm not being political here. It's pure mathematics. If you have 99 people making $50,000 per year and one person making $50 million per year, what's going to happen to the mean income? It's going to be pulled way up by the one very rich person. Even though the mode, or the most common observation in your sample, is the same as the median income, $50,000, the mean will be over $500,000. Another type of evidence that sociologists use is qualitative data, or information that's not in numerical form. Where quantitative data try to measure, qualitative data try to illustrate or characterize. Sometimes the information that you need can't or shouldn't be distilled into a number in a spreadsheet. Instead, you use descriptions of the world gathered through interviews, questionnaires, and first-hand observation. Like, why do some people get married and some people commit to long-term partnerships without getting married? Maybe some of that is quantifiable, but a lot of the process behind making a decision like that is going to come down to how the couple feels about marriage, and that can't be easily stated in a statistic. There are, of course, limitations to sociology as a positivist discipline. Not everything you want to know about society is going to fit into observable, measurable categories. And what's worse, I don't know if you've noticed this, but human beings are pretty unpredictable. In much of the natural sciences, the environment in which research is done is completely controlled by scientists. Like microbes in a petri dish, they're probably not going to develop free will and mess around with your carefully designed experiment. But if you're studying human behavior, you can't control the environment or how your subject interacts with that environment. So if you're interested in, say, the effects of quality parenting on child development, you can't randomly assign babies to parents. Because ethics. Parents apparently want to raise their own spawn. But more than that, you might not want to be controlling the environment so much. If you're interested in how humans behave in the real world, you don't want your research methods to make them act differently than they otherwise would. Because the fact is, subjects might change how they behave if they know they're being observed. For a really fun and fascinating example of this, let's go to the thought bubble. In the late 1920s, Austrian sociologist Elton Mayo went to a telephone factory known as the Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois. His goal was to help the Western Electric Company figure out how to make its workers more productive. So Mayo split the factory staff into groups: a control group who kept working under the same conditions as always, and an experimental group. For the experimental group, Mayo made a series of changes to their working environment. He gave them different work hours, changed up their rest breaks, even turned up the lights on the factory floor. And lo and behold, the changes seemed to work. The workers in the experimental group became more productive and absenteeism dropped. But the truth is, the changes to the physical environment weren't what made the difference. Yes, brightening the room made the workers more productive, but it turned out so did dimming the lights, and so did reversing all of the other changes that Mayo made. Eventually, Mayo realized that the workers were working harder because he was observing them. The fact that the workers knew someone was watching how hard they worked made them want to work harder. And this finding at the Hawthorne Works led future researchers to be much more aware of how their own presence influenced their findings. And to this day, the influence of an observer on the behavior of her participants is known as the Hawthorne effect. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So yes, studying humans and their behavior scientifically can be challenging. But yet another problem with positivist sociology is that not all social facts can be applied to all people in all time periods. In other words, truth is not always objective. It's like when you tell someone about your favorite book. If you're trying to convince them that Harry Potter is objectively the best book series ever written, then you don't know what the word objectively means at all. There is no objective truth about what the best book is. That's strictly subjective, an idea that's built on your own experiences and feelings. But as sociologists, we still find subjective experiences to be valid and important and even worth studying, even if we can't generalize them into some capital T truth about the world. Instead, we might be interested in how patterns in people's subjective experiences form the structures that make up our social world. In sociology, we talk about subjectivity as the meaning that people give to their own lived experiences. And this brings us to another way of doing sociology. Interpretive sociology is the study of society that focuses on the meanings that people attach to their social world, while positivist sociology is more interested in whether a person acts a certain way, something you can see as an outside observer. Interpretive sociology asks, why this behavior? What's the meaning behind it? And how do people view their own actions and thoughts? Interpretive sociologists approach their subjects with the aim of seeing the world from their subject's perspective, rather than through quantitative data. So there are fewer statistics involved in this type of research. Instead, interpretive sociologists often use interviews or face-to-face interactions with their subjects to understand the world. Now, there's one more school of thought about how the science of sociology can be conducted, and it actually relaxes some of the assumptions we made early on about the objectivity of the researcher. These thinkers believe there's plenty of room in sociology for subjectivity, especially for values. Values are the ideas a person has about what's good and the attitudes they hold about how the world works. And curiosity about a research topic often springs from these very values. Many researchers are drawn to the study of sociology out of a desire to understand moral or political questions about how societies work. Like, what's the relationship between race and poverty in the United States? How can understanding that relationship help break the connection between race and poverty? The argument for value-driven research rather than value-free research is one of the origins of critical sociology, or the study of society that focuses on the need for social change. These ideas go back a long time, starting as early as the 19th century when Jane Addams developed the Hull House, an organization that not only provided things like housing and education to low-income people in Chicago, but also researched the causes of and solutions to the ills of poverty. We'll explore all these schools of thought throughout the rest of the series. But for now, we talked about sociology as a science. We discussed positivist sociology and how sociologists use empirical evidence to explore questions about the social world. And we introduced two alternatives: interpretive sociology and critical sociology. Next time, we're going to learn how sociologists actually do their research. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people.
Okay, so the research process itself. So the most basic form of the research process is you come up with a question. What is it that you're seeing in the social world that you don't understand, right? You prepare a research design that can then help you answer that question. You go out and you collect the data, and then you analyze and interpret the data. It's pretty simple, right? So if I was trying to understand how media representations affect body image, right? My question could be, do stereotypical hyper-masculine and hyper-feminine portrayals of men and women in the media affect people's self-esteem about their own body image, right? That could be my research question. So I prepare a research design. Since I'm talking about people's issues with their own bodies and body image in relationship to media representations, then I would probably do something maybe qualitative, right? Maybe interview people about their feelings. You could do something more quant, like a survey, right? That looks at, depending on your, gender identification, how do you feel that these representations affect your own internalized sense of body image? You could do it that way, or you could even kind of do a mixed method survey where you have some options for answering yourself and some options for in the actual rigorous survey. And then you'd actually collect that data, right? Do interviews, do the survey, whatever it is. And then you would analyze and interpret the data to see whether or not what you found supported your hypothesis that you made at the end of your lit review, right? So it's pretty straightforward. But this is, of course, just a very simple version of what's much more complicated, what the research process actually is. So typically, this is how you're actually going to write up something for this class, right? This is how you're going to do your research in this class. You select a research topic in general. So that topic with the previous example would have just been media representations and body image, right? The first thing you do after you pick your topic is you have to start looking at the literature, right? How can you have a hypothesis about something if you don't know anything about the topic that you're hypothesizing about, right? By doing a lit review, you're just reviewing all of the relevant literature within that paradigm that might explain or might look at issues before you even got to that research that can help illuminate your own research, right? Why do the same thing someone has already done when you can illuminate something different by understanding the limitations of previous research, right? So you start looking at theories, you start reviewing the literature, and you formulate a research question, right? Something we'll talk about in one of the assignments you'll have for this class is formulating a research question, where you ask something that has a testable option, right? Not just like, is there inequality or something like that, right? That's kind of bizarre. You would have to ask something kind of more specific, right? Something that can be measured and tested, right? So like the one I said before, this idea of like, does watching media affect people's internalized body image issues, right? Those kind of things. So then you prepare the design based on your question, because remember, your research question asks a question, and the whole point of your research is to answer that question. Yes or no, right? Does the media cause us to hate our bodies, right? Is there some evidence to support that based on your research, or was there not, Was it that people in your research said, no, that doesn't affect me at all, right? That's something that's important to find, right? So the idea of designing the research is, how do you pick a method that'll answer your question? So if you're asking a question like what, like a big, large scale question of like, is there residential inequality, or looking at some of these kind of larger scale things, then it makes much more sense to pick a quantitative research design that can actually explore that. If you're looking at people's maybe like why someone does something that they do, interviews are obviously kind of the go-to thing there, because you can actually literally ask a person. It's one thing to say like, do you feel you're being discriminated against? That's something you could ask in a survey. But why do you feel that that's happening? It's a lot harder to measure in a quantitative style, right? Qualitative gives you the opportunity to observe populations, to understand their meanings, all of those kind of things. So again, which one you pick has everything to do with what your question is asking, right? So let's say I'm using the same population, like I'm looking at people that are transgender, right? Let's say I want to do a quantitative design because my question looks at something like, do transgender, like let's say transgender students have certain issues that they face that other students don't, right? I could look at that from a quantitative, position of a survey and like give out a survey to students in general and see whether or not demographically there are differences, right, between students who identify as cis or students who identify as trans or whatever this is. And then on the other side of that, if I was really trying to look at what specific feelings and emotions were felt by people when they experienced those issues and hardships and other things they had to deal with that other students didn't, then I would be looking at much more of a qualitative thing, right? Of either observation, interviews, kind of actually engaging with the group so that they can explain in their own words how they feel, right? Because surveys are great, but they only usually give you a Likert scale of strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And sometimes, you want to answer a question, but you are so restricted by the question itself, you can't really elaborate. That's where the qualitative comes in. So again, how you figure out which one you pick is all about your question. So then you get to the research ethics, right? You make sure that your design is not going to negatively affect your participants, because we're studying people. We have to make sure we're not harming them, right? Then you develop the actual measures you're going to use, your methodology. And then you select your sample from the overall population you're studying. And we'll talk about this more in depth later, but your population is the group you want to study. So if I was looking at Kelsey Fullerton transgender identifying students, then that would be my population. My sample would be the people I actually talked to or gave a survey to or researched, right? So then you collect the data, meaning you go out and do the stuff you said you were going to do, right? And then, of course, what kind of data you're collecting depends on your research design. So if you're doing an experiment, a survey, qualitative research, all of these different things, there's a lot of different ways to do the actual research itself. But no matter what, you're going to try and analyze and interpret the data. If it's quantitative, this is usually going to be a statistical measure, right, of some kind. There's various different measures depending on the kind of things you're trying to look at or the types of variable relationships you're looking at, which we'll talk about in much more in depth later. And then with qualitative, typically same thing. There's kind of a various ways that this can be analyzed and interpreted, but oftentimes you're going to be, let's say you're doing an interview, you're going to transcribe the interview and you're going to code the interview for themes. Or if you're doing a historical analysis or something like that, you would typically be coding your data for certain themes or certain things that you see over and over. So how you actually analyze it, you typically then look at the theory and how that relates to what you found, and then you write up your report. There's very different ways to write up quantitative research from qualitative research, something that we will go through in depth later, but this is really just your introduction, basic chapter of like, what is all this stuff we're going to be talking about. Okay, so when it comes to the approaches to social research, there's 4 basic ways, right? There's experiments, right? The classic research method where social scientists study issues in a lab setting. And they do this so they can control which variables they're studying without the outside influence that research outside of the lab is affected by. So its strength is also its limitation in a way. So you can control the variables in the lab to understand how those certain variables interact. But outside of the lab setting, there's many other variables that can affect outcomes. So sometimes these lab experiments are not as real world since they are secluded, right? Surveys are another popular one, right? They're a way to measure attitudes and opinions of many people, relatively quick, financially cheap. This is part of why they're so popular, and you've probably taken many of these in your own life. They are easy to distribute and analyze. And so in this class, you're going to produce research and not just consume it. One of your future assignments is constructing an effective survey tool in order to study a topic of your choice. So then you're going to distribute that to classmates and others and analyze the results while writing up what the methods you used were, your sampling method, how you measure the results, your limitations, all that fun stuff. I'm not trying to scare you now, I'm just letting you know. But anyway, qualitative research is a methodological approach that typically looks at small scale questions in a micro level way, such as small group interactions, interviews, ethnographies, as well as many others and variants of each one. So it's often field research or observational research. So if you like people watching, you may be interested in qualitative research. So we'll talk about all of these in much more detail later. What you need to know in regard to the difference between qualitative and quantitative is that quantitative deals with numbers, while qualitative typically deals with human expressions. Or put another way, quantitative typically asks what questions and qualitative typically asks why questions. But we're going to get to that later. This is very brief. And then there's existing data analysis, which is using existing sources in order to analyze something different than the original research or source focused on. So which one you pick really depends on what kind of question you have, right? So there's not like a right or wrong. It's what is right for the research, and, meaning the research question asks a question and the method has to answer that question, right? So they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. But it's important just to know what those things are. All right, so experiments can involve manipulation and control. So the idea is to take to the lab an experiment where a researcher can control the situation in order to focus on specific variables. So this is ideal for understanding the causes of human behavior because you can limit the influence of outside influences or variables in order to understand the relationship between specific variables. But this is also a limitation. It's limited to what can be manipulated within the experimental realm. Also, it can often raise questions of ethics. So again, like I said before, as we're studying people, we need to make sure we're treating them with respect and dealing with them ethically. Especially with some research like the Milgram experiment, right, where deception is involved to see if people are willing to go against their conscience because an authority figure, encourages them to do so. People in the experiment showed psychological signs of extreme stress as they thought they were harming another person with shocks in the next room. So, things like that, we have to make sure if we're going to do research to try and understand something about human behavior, we have to make sure we're not harming people in the process. So another kind of ethical issue was the famous Bobo doll experiment, which I put a video of it in here. I'm going to include that in here right now just so you get a little background to this. And it does overlap psychology, of course, as social psychology was kind of some of the research roots of the sociological paradigm as well. So there's kind of an overlap when it comes to experimental research. But when it comes to ethics, research that involves children can be especially controversial.
It's 1961. You're wandering around Stanford University looking for a sandwich or something when you happen to walk by a particular room in a particular lab and see something a little unnerving. Namely, you find a woman punching an inflatable clown named Bobo in the neck, over and over in its neck. This was the lab of legendary psychologist Albert Bandura, and in 1961 he was studying one of the most important phenomena in psychology. See, while that woman was throttling that big inflatable clown, there was a child watching her, and after about 10 minutes of observing this clown-beating display, the kid was taken to a room full of fun toys, which were soon taken away, and then the frustrated kid was left alone with Bobo. And Bandura watched what happened. And yeah, what happened was kind of scary. Kids who watched the woman beating the clown were much more likely to mimic her aggression, kicking, punching, throwing, even attempting to maul Bobo with a hammer. But other children who saw an adult playing nicely with the doll or just ignoring it didn't respond the same way in their frustration. Bandura's results may seem predictable now, but in those days they challenged the dominant behaviorist views that we talked about last week. The views that learning is solely about conditioning and association, rewards and punishments. Bandura's research focused on how learning can occur through observing and imitating someone else's behavior. And if that seems obvious to you, you have Bandura to thank for that. His research hastened the evolution of 20th century experimental psychology from pure behaviorism into what we now know as social cognitive learning. While it was closely related to behaviorism, the social cognitive models added profoundly new dimensions to what Skinner and Watson and Pavlov had observed in our feathered and furry friends. In other words, it showed us that just as there's more than one way to beat up a clown, there's more than one way to learn.
Okay, so surveys typically involve asking questions of a relatively large, randomly selected group of people. So this could be about their habits or opinions or whatever it is. And they yield precise statistical estimates of group characteristics. So this is why who the sample is and who the overall population is important to designing a survey. So the hope of a good survey is to have a lot of respondents so you can see how valid your findings are and look at demographic differences that may align with different responses. And so there's a limitation, obviously, that respondents may not be truthful. But I mean, that's kind of a limitation of all research with people, right? People may lie. So the idea of surveys is that there will be some small margin of error that's accounted for. If the survey tool is effective, you will have effective results. And, sometimes people, what they say is not what they'll actually do, right? We like to think of ourselves a certain way, and sometimes we do not practice what we preach. So this is important to keep in mind as you construct a survey, so you can get past this whole idealized notion of self and combine that with questions about specific or hypothetical actions that could balance against that particular weakness. All right, and when it comes to qualitative research, this typically involves observing people in natural settings or interviewing them in depth. So sometimes observing, sometimes participant observation, sometimes just through interviews. Qualitative research aims to understand the whys and the motivations for what people do and how they organize and live their lives. So qualitative research provides rich information on social meanings and processes. So qualitative researchers are not looking at a group within, with this kind of ethnocentric gaze or othering or prejudice. They instead are trying to understand the meanings and the motivations of the people who are being observed or studied. They want to know what the population's meanings are, what their vocabulary is, right? What their habits are, as well as other things that structure their world and perspective so that the researchers can analyze these things without an outsider gaze that may stereotype or misrepresent the group. So we'll talk about the various forms of qualitative research as we go on through the course. So often it's difficult to know the generalizability of research results because the method has small sample sizes. What you see in the research may not be something that can be extrapolated to the overall population. So for example, if you're studying opinions of Cal State Fullerton sociology online students, right? What you find would not apply to all sociology students or all Cal State Fullerton students or even all students in the history of ever, right? What you find is important, but it cannot be assumed to apply to every other person outside of that limited population being studied. So there might be something different about specifically Cal State Fullerton sociology online students that might be different from the overall population of the university or just of college students in general, right? So, but qualitative research often focuses on marginalized or understudied populations. So that can be very helpful in filling in the gaps in research or opening research up to smaller, more marginalized populations that just haven't had focus on their communities, which can often dispel stereotypes. Another way to go about research is analyzing existing data. So this typically involves the analysis of data not produced directly by the researcher who uses it. So this could be, for example, a very popular one is using the census, right, to study things. Population changes, demographic changes, right? Or maybe something like racial compositions of neighborhoods, which could be used to measure environmental racism arguments that people of color are situated in the most environmentally destructive areas, such as living next to landfills or petrochemical plants or things like that. You can use the existing data to try and understand these things. So this is well suited to studying the past and social change. So you can go back and look at things with the hindsight that those sources did not have in the time when they were produced. Like, if you're interested in the relationship between the president and the media, one could look back at media reports and representations of presidents in specific media over a historical period of time to see just how different things are nowadays, right? And so another great thing is that data is often unobtrusive, so you don't have to worry about the influence of the researcher or what is called the Hawthorne effect, which we'll discuss further later. But where someone, if they know they're being researched, they might change how they act, right? So that's not going to be a problem that you're going to face if you're using existing data at all. And the last part, though, the limitation is that it may be difficult to find data that can adequately address the research question that you're asking. So you're not doing the direct research. It can be difficult to find the info that's perfect for, what you're looking at. So again, if going back to the racial composition of neighborhoods example from before, if you were using the census, which a lot of people do, you would need to see how over time the racial definitions that are used and categories used on the census have changed a lot. So some ethnicities, especially mixed race individuals, were not measured as an option on the census for periods of time, or certain racialized groups have been included in the category of white or excluded in various periods of time. Giving people the opportunity to check more than one box changes this, right? So you have to understand the historical relevance of the source that you're using and kind of the time period in which it comes from in order to not, kind of misconstrue or, to help you address your research questions effectively, right? By understanding the context of those things.